Hi, this is Sarah Otero Iser. I am recording this sermon that I gave last night. It is Shabbat Chukat, and I gave it's called The Politics of Anger. So forgive the humidity here, but here's the sermon that I gave. We seem to be living in a time of sudden upheaval, and things change from moment to moment. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, wrote an article in the Daily Telegraph that perfectly encapsulated my feelings about our current time. So forgive me if I read to you from a large section of that article. He is far more eloquent than a summary from me would do justice. He writes, "This is not politics as usual. I can recall nothing like it in my lifetime. But the hurricane blowing through Britain is not unique to us. In one form or another, it is hitting every Western democracy, including the United States. There is a widespread feeling that politicians have been failing us. The real question is, what kind of leadership do we need to steer us through the storm? What we are witnessing throughout the West is a new politics of anger. There is anger at the spread of unemployment, leaving whole regions and generations bereft of hope. There is anger at the failure of successive governments to control immigration and to integrate some of the new arrivals. There is anger at the financiers who brought the global economy to the brink of disaster and yet continued to reward themselves as if nothing had happened. There is anger at CEOs using public corporations for private benefit. There is anger that while a few have benefited disproportionately from the global economy, most people have seen their standards of living stay static or decline. There is anger at the perceived impotence of governments to control the spread of extremism and terror. There is a widespread feeling that the world in this 21st century is running out of control. This has led in France, Greece, Austria, Hungary, and Poland to a resurgence of the far right. Elsewhere, there is an emerging alliance of the far left and radical political Islam. These are dangerous forces, the far right seeking a return to a golden age that never was, the far left in pursuit of a utopia that will never be. They are both enemies of freedom. Meanwhile, figures have emerged like Nigel Farage and Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in the United States, who are essentially anti-political politicians, populists whose appeal is that they channel widespread anger at the existing elites. Anti-political politicians raise expectations that cannot be met. When reality bites, the anger becomes deeper and darker. Rabbi Sacks goes on to describe some of the factors which he believes are contributing to this, but I feel like this is a good place to pause. In our Torah portion this week, we see that this politics of anger is nothing new. After the death of Moses' sister Miriam, the well that followed her through the desert dried up, leaving the camp completely without water. As Rabbi Sacks reminds us, when reality bites, the anger becomes deeper and darker. The people rise up against Moses and Aaron. If only we had perished when our brothers perished at the instance of God. Why have you brought God's congregation into this wilderness for us and our beasts to die there? Why did you make us leave Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? A place with no grain, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates. There is not even water to drink. Their anger is understandable, but it lacks any sort of perspective. Why did Moses and Aaron lead them into the desert? To escape slavery. The people had forgotten how brutal life was under Egyptian chains, how bruised and beaten they were. In less than a generation, their vision had become short-sighted and self-interested. so too do we find ourselves indulging in a vision of a past that never was. We forget that in the glory days of the post-war boom, black and brown-skinned people were barred from communal restrooms and water fountains. Jews opened their own country clubs because we couldn't access white country clubs. Women were barred from many jobs, and I could not stand before you as your rabbi. And perhaps more personally to me, I couldn't have gone to the same public schools as white children because I am Latina. Despite this, many Americans are angry. The civil rights battles of the 60s seem to not have been enough. Racial differences in social experiences are stark. The young are drowning in student debt. Those in the middle are crushed under the weight of taking care of children and aging parents. And we are all watching our hard-earned money shrink before our eyes. We cry out to our leaders to take us back to better times, forgetting the hard-won progress that got us this far. And Moses, our leader? Moses responds with anger. Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you from this rock? After God tells him to just speak to the rock, and God will grant water, Moses instead strikes it twice. Water indeed comes from the rock, but Moses suffers the consequences of his anger. God said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them." The anger of our leaders leads us into danger when it is misguided and self-aggrandizing instead of righteous. But none of us is Moses, a great leader directly communicating with God. Abravanel, a 15th century Portuguese commentator on the Torah, asks a question at this point. Since it was Moses who struck the rock, why was Aaron punished at all? Aaron, the silent bystander to the sin of his brother, is punished with the same fate as his brother, death. Perhaps even more confounding, Aaron dies at God's command only a few verses later, while Moses is left to live until the very edge of the promised land. Why such an unfair decree? Perhaps it is because Aaron committed an equal, if not greater, sin than Moses' anger, the sin of silence. The Talmud tells us that silence is like a scent, and tells us that we can either speak up or be participants in the sin we witness. The Talmud reminds us that there is no neutrality when it comes to injustice. Rabbi Judah Loew, the Maharal of Prague, wrote, "While a person may be individually pious, such good will pale in the face of the sin of not protesting against an emerging communal evil. Not only will such piety not avert the impending evil, but such a pious person will be accountable for having been able to prevent it and for not doing so." Aaron had the power to speak up and yet abstained. Aaron could have answered Moses' insult with righteousness and fairness and did not. Aaron could have done literally anything but remain silent, and chose instead to turn a blind eye to his brother's politics of anger. How much are we like Aaron today? How much do we turn a blind eye to the injustices around us? How much do we beg powerlessness as an excuse for inaction? How much do we avoid correcting what seem like small sins perpetrated by those around us? Oh, come on. It was only a little racist comment. It's not really worth the trouble. Come on, Moses only hit the rock. Is that so terrible? Chukat reminds us that we are all held accountable when we witness wrongdoing. God expects us to be more than bystanders. We have a responsibility to stand up to those leaders engaging in the politics of anger, and that responsibility intersects with our responsibility to lift up all those around us. While it is tempting for me to end by reminding you to love the stranger, I would instead like to close with a short parable. Rachel Naomi Remen interviewed a Holocaust survivor, Yitzhak, at a retreat for people with cancer for her book, Kitchen Table Wisdom. Initially uncomfortable with being vulnerable with a group of strangers, Yitzhak told Rachel at their last meeting that he took up the matter with God and asked God what the retreat was all about. Yitzhak said, "So I say to him, God, is it okay to love the strangers?" And God says to me, "Yitzhak, what is this strangers? You make strangers. I don't make strangers." This week, as we listen to the news and hear about the upheaval in our world, I challenge you to learn from Moses and Aaron's deadly mistakes. Instead of engaging in the politics of anger, listen for God's voice and seek understanding. Instead of being a silent bystander, speak up for what you know is right. And instead of trying desperately to love those strangers who are so different from you, try instead to make no one you encounter a stranger. Shabbat Shalom.